In the hyper-competitive politics of the late Republic, electoral rivalry could quickly turn to personal enmity, as aristocrats sought to perpetually one-up each other while climbing the ladder of offices known as the cursus honorum. Cato and Caesar are the most well-known example of this personal animosity, with the irreconcilable hatred between the steadfast conservative ideologue and the patrician populist directly contributing to the Roman Republic's deadliest civil war. But in a setting where political ideology was often quite malleable and alliances were constantly shifting, it was possible for those with similar politics to still have great distaste for one another, as was often the case between Pompey and Crassus. Both had risen to prominence as lieutenants of Sulla, but campaigned and governed with a distinct populare bent. Nevertheless, until reconciled by Caesar in the first triumvirate, the two men absolutely despised one another. Such was the intensity of the competition to be recognized as the most preeminent man in Rome. But perhaps the most interesting example of political rivalry spilling over into a ferocious blood feud is the contentious relationship between Marcus Tullius Cicero and the radical populist Publius Clodius Pulcher. In retrospect, they seem destined to clash. Cicero was born into a family of rural Italian equestrians and had no great lineage to invoke as he rose to prominence in Rome. This fueled his obsession with winning the consulship, but also left him with a chip on his shoulder towards the elite families that formed the inner circle of Roman politics. Though, despite some ill feelings, he was always willing to debase himself to gain their seal of approval. Clodius could not have been more different in his disposition. A scion of Rome's most eminent patrician clan, the Claudians, he was thoroughly blue-blooded, and could boast consuls, censors, and generals in his ancestry, while Cicero couldn't even name a single senator prior to himself. But, compounding his dissimilarity with the great orator, Clodius renounced his esteemed family tree and arranged to be adopted into a plebeian family so that he could stand for the tribunate. His disrespect for tradition was so great that the man who in theory was Clodius's new adoptive father was actually younger than him. But just to make it clear that this was all for show, Clodius was immediately legally emancipated. He even changed his name, dropping the powerful moniker Claudius in favor of the more base, but infinitely more common, Clodius. In a political climate where names and family prestige were so associated with greatness, it was a move that must have rankled Cicero to no end, as he saw a man born into the wealth and privilege he coveted just throw it all away to win the adoration of the masses. Bad blood between the two was probably inevitable, but what may have initially began as personal distaste quickly escalated after a bit of cross-dressing. Let me explain. Clodius had attempted to infiltrate an all-female religious ceremony dedicated to Bona Dea, the good goddess, but was quickly discovered. His presence was seen as contaminating the ritual, and in a society where religion and state were so thoroughly intertwined, a prosecution naturally followed for the profane impropriety which endangered Rome's sacred bond to the gods. The penalties for such impiety were severe, but Clodius's defense rested on his own word. He said he had an alibi, that he was out of Rome at the time of the rites, so it couldn't have possibly been him. By all accounts, this was an outrageous lie, but Roman trials were rarely decided by things so quaint as actual guilt or innocence. Rosters of superstar lawyers and bribes to jurors were much more influential to the outcome of a trial than the actual particulars of the case. Still, despite knowing that mere testimony was unlikely to sway the jury, Cicero went on the record stating that Clodius had in fact been in Rome. In doing so, he kicked the proverbial hornet's nest and earned himself an enemy for life. Despite his alibi falling apart, Clodius would still be acquitted, but Cicero claimed that in order to raise funds to bribe the jurors, he had made himself destitute. This may be a case of Cicero's famous exaggeration and self-aggrandizement, but if Clodius had been the one stuck with the bill, then it is likely that the jury didn't come cheap. There is speculation that Crassus may have been the one to bribe the jurors on Clodius's behalf, because soon after this episode, he emerges as the attack dog of the triumvirs, getting his hands dirty with populist rabble-rousing to clear the way for the agenda of Crassus, Pompey, and Caesar. It was with the backing of his strong urban plebeian base and the three most prominent men in Rome that Clodius coasted to victory in the tribunician elections of 59 and embarked on a radical political program that sought to remake the framework of religious authority in Rome, to seize the sacred and Rome's relationship with the divine itself from the hands of the old aristocracy. In addition, he expanded on the grain dole introduced by Caius Gracchus, making it free for all citizens in Rome. But beyond just passing populist legislation, Clodius also used his office to settle personal scores. He introduced a bill that would punish magistrates who killed citizens without trial. This seems innocuous enough, and even has the veneer of upholding solid constitutional principles of the citizen's dignity and the limited power of magistrates. But what gave the game away was Clodius's inclusion of a provision in his bill that would apply the law retroactively, meaning past magistrates could be punished for actions that violated a law which had not been codified at the time. Clodius could argue, of course, that killing a citizen without trial had in fact been illegal all along, and he was merely confirming this reality. But the truth is, the law was directed squarely at Cicero for his treatment of citizens involved in the Catilinarian conspiracy while he was consul. This law was part of a concerted campaign by Clodius, apparently with the backing of the triumvirs, to isolate Cicero and remove him as a player in Roman politics. Clodius had already used procedural tricks to force Cato out of the city by assigning him a dead-end job on Cyprus that would keep the leader of the reactionary oligarchy out of Rome for over a year. If you're enjoying this video, please do us a favor by liking, commenting, and subscribing. We're a small channel, and this is the only way to get the almighty YouTube algorithm to notice us. Furthermore, you can help Tribunate become more sustainable by becoming a member for as little as 99 cents a month. Thank you for all of your support. After Cato's removal, Cicero was subjected to a campaign of mob violence by Clodius's support base, hounded at every opportunity, jeered in the forum, and continually reminded that the threat of prosecution under Clodius's new law loomed over him. It was a time of great uncertainty and sadness for Cicero, as he realized that his connections were everywhere, turning their backs on him. He was utterly alone, without friend or ally in the great bubbling cauldron that was late Republican politics, and he had reason to fear not just for his political career, but for his very life. Able to read the writing on the wall, Cicero left the city, under cover of night, going into exile on his own before Clodius could bring him to trial, or worse, arrange for him to come face to face with a knife in some dark Roman alley. This exile would be the low point in Cicero's life, and it is evident by reading his correspondence that he did not believe he would ever be able to return to Rome. But though Clodius seemed victorious, he was not content with simply forcing Cicero out. He would then carry a law that formally exiled Cicero and prohibited his recall. Adding salt in the wound, Clodius had Cicero's house destroyed and a shrine to the goddess Libertas, or Liberty, raised in its place. The mansion on the Palatine Hill had been a point of pride for Cicero, a sign that the country lawyer had truly made it into the upper strata of Roman society. Clodius had it leveled and made it a centerpiece of his own propaganda efforts, infusing it with a sense of the divine so that Cicero could never again raise a home there, lest he be accused of impiety and disrespecting the goddess. The success of his legislative program and his proven ability to deliver for the people, despite the opposition of conservatives like Cato and Cicero, only added to Clodius's public following. But as was so typical in Roman politics, success, prestige, and fame began to work against Clodius, by uniting his opponents against him, lest he gain any more power and influence. As the extent of his support and following became known, the relationship between Clodius and Pompey soon deteriorated into open hostility, and even his alliance with Caesar began to fray. Things remained in working order with Crassus, however, supporting the idea that he may have been the silent partner backing Clodius's rise from the start. But despite this connection and the collaboration between the two, we must stress that Clodius had the prestige of a great family behind him, as well as the power and influence he had earned in his own right as a leader of the urban plebs. He was an ally of the triumvirs, particularly Crassus, but he was never a pawn. The fracture with Pompey undermined Clodius's campaign against Cicero, and Pompey sought the orator's recall, whether because he realized the exile had been a mistake, or because he knew that Cicero would immediately take his spot as the target of Clodius's antagonism, is unknown, though the conservative nobility had never truly accepted him as one of their own. Cicero did enjoy a massive support base among the rural Italian elite, as those of the equestrian class were proud to see someone of their status reach the consulship. The legal push to formally recall Cicero lasted for months, and the rallies in support of the bill were frequently beset by mob violence, though now it was no longer one-sided. The conservatives had learned the value of urban riots and had enlisted Titus Annius Milo to serve as the mirror image of Clodius. Milo commanded gangs every bit as violent as those employed by Clodius, and he would flex his muscle across the city in much the same way that Clodius had, using intimidation and threats, as well as good old-fashioned violence to counter Clodius and pave the way for the conservative agenda of his aristocratic backers. But despite connections to the old conservatives, Milo would also emerge as an occasional proxy for Pompey in much the same way Clodius could often serve as an agent of Crassus, though Pompey would vigorously oppose Milo's later campaign for the consulship, perhaps because he already promised to secure the office to two more esteemed candidates, or maybe he just wanted his attack dog to know his place and thought the consulship too great an honor for the man who was, after all, just hired muscle. Republican politics were very messy, and it was rare to find a single politician that could boast a consistent ideological vision that aligns with what we perceive as being the dominating factor in modern politics. Instead, it was more often about personal glory and advancement, meaning there were often strange bedfellows, such as when Cato and Clodius collaborated in an attempt to undo some of Caesar's legislation as consul. Caesar had always been the bond that held the triumvirate together, and with him away in Gaul, the alliance was fragmenting, allowing the conservative oligarchs the opportunity to reassert control in the wake of infighting by separating Pompey and Crassus, the two men who were still regarded as the real power behind the triumvirate. Pompey's collaboration with the senatorial elite to recall Cicero, combined with the pressure applied by Milo's thugs, saw the recall law passed. No sooner had Cicero returned to the city than he again took up his feud with Clodius. The two held a heated debate on whether the Shrine of Liberty could be removed so that Cicero's old home could be reconstructed. When approval to begin rebuilding the home was granted, Clodius's gangs disrupted work on the site. Clodius was elected aedile for 56 and continued to spar with Cicero, such as at the trial of Milo, where Clodius served as prosecutor and Cicero as the chief defense. With Clodius's electoral win and reconciliation with the recently renewed triumvirate, his star was again on the rise, and he used his position in Rome's religious order to claim that recent prodigies interpreted as signs of divine displeasure were a result of Cicero offending the gods by destroying the shrine to liberty. Cicero countered by saying that actually the gods were upset at Clodius for his desecration of the Bona Dea rites years earlier. The feud reached a boiling point that year in the trial of Marcus Caelius Rufus, an ally of Milo, but also the lover of Clodia, sister of Clodius. I have avoided discussing her so far as she is one of the most intriguing women of the late Republic, and deserves her own dedicated episode, as does Fulvia, Clodius's wife and later the wife of Mark Antony. Rufus was accused of trying to poison Clodia, and also, for good measure, of killing an Egyptian diplomat. In his defense of Rufus, Cicero engages in brutal character assassination against Clodius and Clodia, accusing the two of engaging in incest, a rumor which was apparently already in circulation. He decried Clodia as a drunk and a perpetual seducer of men, and said she was a lewd and depraved prostitute, among other erudite insults. But he would not waste his most choice barbs on a woman, and saved a great deal of invective for Clodius, saying, "My refutation would be framed in considerably more forcible terms if I did not feel inhibited by the fact that the woman's husband, brother, I always make that slip, is my personal enemy." With the help of Cicero and Crassus, Rufus would be acquitted. There was a brief respite in the feud after Clodius was appointed to a prestigious and highly lucrative position on an embassy to the east. This plum appointment was likely a favor from Crassus and Pompey for Clodius's work securing their election as consuls for 55, and his rallying support for the passage of the Lex Tribonia, which gave both men strong proconsular governorships after their term in office expired. Here we see again the danger of looking at Roman politics too dogmatically, because Pompey and Clodius were once again seemingly on good terms, or at least willing to scratch each other's backs. But to the last, there was no reconciliation with Cicero, and when Clodius was murdered by Milo's thugs while traveling back to Rome in January 52, Cicero was elated that his bête noire was finally out of his hair for good. Despite the popular outrage over Milo's untimely end, his supporters even burned down the Senate house in retribution, Cicero leapt to Milo's defense and volunteered to lead the legal team assembled to acquit him of the murder. However, Clodius seems to have gotten the last laugh, as Cicero was so terrified by the Clodian crowd at the trial that he got cold feet and was unable to deliver his speech. Deprived of his defense, but also to sate public anger, Milo would be convicted and forced into exile in Marseille. In a frankly bizarre move, Cicero did send Milo a copy of the speech he was planning to deliver at the trial, and it makes his true feelings about Clodius known. "I do not propose to ask you to waive the present charge in consideration of my client's many distinguished services to the state, nor to demand that, if the death of Publius Clodius has proved your salvation, you should therefore ascribe it to the merits of Milo, rather than to the good fortune of the Roman people." Milo, perhaps underwhelmed or maybe nursing some bitterness at his lawyer's lack of nerve, wrote back that it was lucky for him those words had not been spoken in that form in the court, for he should not be eating such mullets in Massilia, where he was passing his exile, if any such defense had been made. If my retelling of the feud appears one-sided and too pro-Cicero, I have to apologize. That wasn't my intent, but so much of the evidence here is not just biased, but in fact comes directly from the pen of Cicero himself. If the man had any talent, it was casting himself as blameless, and his opponents as the most wicked creatures imaginable. So though it looks to us as if Clodius is a rabid wolf intent on hunting down the innocent Cicero for the mere crime of his excellent oratory, that almost certainly isn't how it actually transpired. It takes two for a feud like this to develop and be sustained, so there is no doubt that Cicero's hands are dirty as well, despite his efforts to obscure this. There is a temptation to see this feud as a symptom of Roman decay, of a republic reduced and on its last legs, when its leaders acted with such reckless abandon for selfish ends. But the reality is that these animosities were in keeping with republican tradition, shorn of ideology or any goal beyond their own prestige. The dangerous game these men played was one that had occurred countless times throughout the Republican era. It was a different feud, a different rivalry, and one that occurred alongside the clash between Clodius and Cicero, which would serve as the harbinger of the Republic's destruction, for Cato and Caesar were drawing ever nearer to a confrontation. Yes, between the men themselves, but also, more importantly, between two distinct and irreconcilable visions for the future of Rome. The Republic would collapse under the weight of these contradictions, as the Republic lay dying, and the new world of the Caesars struggled to be born.